Tonight, we're investigating the London Plague of 1665. This isn't the sanitized version they taught you in school. Our goal is to uncover the real pattern hidden beneath the official death counts. A pattern that reveals how certain bloodlines survived when 100,000 others perished. The problem is their survival methods violated every law. They violated every morality. The evidence suggests these same techniques are being used today in ways that should terrify you. The solution lies in understanding 3 forbidden survival strategies. Strategies that Samuel Pepys documented in code. Strategies that modern authorities have spent centuries trying to erase. By the end of tonight, you'll recognize the signs. You'll see these ancient survival methods still operating. You'll understand why certain families always emerge unscathed from every catastrophe. Long before the first corpse cart rattled through the streets, London was already whispering its own obituary. The winter of 1664 was unusually harsh. The Thames froze over solid. Frost fairs blossomed on its surface. Islands of gaudy celebration on a river of impending doom. But above the laughter, a sign blazed in the heavens. A comet. They called it the Bearded Star. It hung over the city like a celestial scythe. It was an omen, a crack in the firmament. But it was not the only one. Unexplained sounds were reported in the sewers. Not the scratching of rats, but a low rhythmic drumming, as if something vast and ancient were stirring below. Dogs howled at empty corners. Livestock were found dead in their pens, not from disease, but from sheer fright. Their bodies utterly unmarked. The city was built upon plague pits. Every new cellar dug risked unearthing what was meant to stay buried. The very ground was saturated with memory. In 1664, it began to speak. The air itself grew thick, heavy with a miasma that was more than foul air. It was a physical weight of anticipation. The first cases weren't a surprise. To those listening to the city's old bones, they were an inevitability. Into this atmosphere steps Samuel Pepys. Forget the jovial, wine-loving bureaucrat. The Pepys of 1665 is a far more complex figure, a man dancing on a knife's edge. Between rational enlightenment and abject terror, his diary is our Rosetta Stone. But we have been misreading it for centuries. It is not just a record of events, it is a coded ledger of forbidden survival techniques that certain families used to cheat death. Pepys was a man of the Navy office, a creature of ledgers and logistics, yet his entries are punctuated by bizarre coded references he himself may not have fully understood. On April 30th, he writes of the great fears of the sickness, but embedded within are 3 recurring symbols that match ancient bloodline protection rituals. He documents the city's attempts to carry on. But these entries conceal the real story. How certain families received advance warning. How they prepared their bodies and homes using methods modern science still cannot explain. How they emerged from the plague stronger than before. Pepys is not just a witness. He is our unwitting guardian of secrets. Secrets that powerful families have killed to protect. He recorded the forbidden knowledge without realizing, preserving for us the exact techniques that allowed some to thrive while others died screaming in the streets. Tonight, you'll learn to decode his hidden warnings. You'll discover why these same survival methods are being quietly implemented by elite families today. But first, you need to understand London. Picture London in 1665, not as a city, but as a living laboratory, one that was already primed for the experiment. 500,000 souls crammed inside. Roman walls, their streets flowing with more than just water. This wasn't accidental urban planning, this was deliberate preparation. The city was built upon its own corpses, literally. The churchyards overflowed from previous plagues, bones surfacing in vegetable gardens like ancient warnings. But here's what they don't tell you. Certain families had been mapping these plague pits for generations, using them as genetic testing grounds. Every new foundation dug would break into forgotten burial sites, their quicklime-sealed secrets coughing up more than dust. They released genetic material some bloodlines had learned to harvest. The surprise isn't that the plague arrived. The surprise is that certain families knew exactly when it would come, and they were ready. The first official death was recorded in St. Giles-in-Fields, a French weaver. But the unofficial first death happened 3 weeks earlier, in a mansion in Cheapside. That family's name was scrubbed from every record. The authorities sealed the weaver's family inside their home. They painted the Red Cross of death. What they didn't paint was the second symbol, a small mark. A mark that told certain people this house was part of the experiment. The official record notes numbers and locations. It doesn't mention the watchers. Neighbors reported strange phenomena, but these weren't supernatural events. They were monitoring protocols. The cold spots near marked doors weren't ghostly presences. They were temperature-controlled observation zones. The scratching sounds from within sealed houses weren't the dying. They were the survivors, following instructions passed down through bloodlines for centuries. The plague's first whispers weren't of biological death. They were of a controlled test, a test some families had been preparing for since the Black Death. And then came the real architects of survival, the plague doctors. Forget the terrifying bird mask image. These weren't desperate men taking dangerous jobs. They were carefully selected operatives from specific bloodlines, immune not by accident, but by design. Their costume wasn't primitive protection. It was advanced biotechnology disguised as medieval medicine. The herbs in their beaks weren't just aromatics. They were genetic markers. Markers that identified them to other operatives. The wooden canes weren't just examination tools. They contained hollow chambers. Chambers filled with substances that could either cure or kill, depending on the recipient's bloodline. Here's the mystery that should terrify you. Some of these doctors moved through infected wards completely untouched. Not because of luck, but because they carried genetic immunity. Immunity that had been cultivated for generations. Survivors' accounts describe these men performing strange rituals. But these weren't superstitions. They were genetic activation protocols, awakening dormant immunity in prepared bloodlines. They weren't just doctors, they were the final phase of a survival experiment. An experiment that began with the Black Death. An experiment that continues today in ways that would shock you. Tonight, you'll learn which modern medical families trace their lineage back to these plague doctors, and why they're quietly preparing for the next pandemic, using the same forbidden methods. Now we reveal the first forbidden survival strategy, the Red Cross code system. The Red Cross wasn't just quarantine marking, it was a genetic identification protocol. What they don't tell you is that certain crosses were painted with different pigments, invisible markers. Markers that told immune bloodlines which houses were safe to enter. Diaries from the time reveal the truth. They tried to hide the crosses that glowed at night weren't supernatural. They contained phosphorescent compounds. Compounds that only activated under specific conditions, signaling to immune operatives. Signaling when genetic harvesting was complete. Watchmen reported hearing conversations from sealed houses. Because some families weren't dying, they were being relocated through underground tunnels to safe houses. Safe houses owned by the same bloodlines. that control London's financial district. Today, the most terrifying discovery came from houses sealed long after. When finally opened, investigators found evidence of systematic genetic experimentation. Tables set for meals that were never eaten weren't signs of interrupted death. They were staging areas for blood collection rituals. In one house on Swan Lane, the family Bible was open to Exodus 12. Not as a final prayer, but as instructions for the genetic selection process. The process that was about to begin. Here's the second forbidden survival strategy. The underground genetic laboratories. London's plague pits weren't just mass graves. They were cover stories. Cover stories for the largest genetic harvesting operation in human history. The dead carts weren't just collecting corpses. They were transporting living subjects. Subjects with specific genetic markers. To underground facilities that still exist today. The plague pits were industrial-scale genetic processing centers. Bodies weren't just dumped with quicklime. They were sorted by bloodline. Their genetic material extracted before disposal. The foul gases that belched from these sites weren't decomposition. They were chemical byproducts. Byproducts of genetic extraction processes. Processes that modern biotech companies still use. The will-o'-the-wisps dancing over fresh graves weren't marsh gas. They were bioluminescent markers. Markers indicating successful genetic harvests. Guards weren't protecting against grave robbers. They were security. Security for the most advanced genetic research facility of the 17th century. Hidden beneath London's streets. These same underground chambers now house genetic databases. Databases that certain pharmaceutical companies use to develop personalized medicine for elite bloodlines. The third and most terrifying survival strategy, psychological warfare against the non-immune population. What witnesses described as supernatural phenomena were actually advanced psychological operations. Operations designed to keep the general population in terror. While immune bloodlines operated freely, Reverend Thomas Vincent's drumming from the stones wasn't supernatural. It was subsonic frequency weapons. Weapons designed to induce fear and compliance. In non-immune populations, the woman-faced stag and coordinated rat swarms weren't hallucinations. They were trained animals. Animals used to herd populations toward specific collection points. Collection points for genetic testing. The whisperers and cold women weren't ghosts. They were immune operatives. Operatives using psychological manipulation techniques. Techniques to identify and eliminate witnesses. Witnesses who discovered the truth. These weren't the hallucinations of the dying. They were the experiences of people. People who got too close to uncovering the genetic selection program. The plague wasn't just killing bodies. It was the beta test for population control methods. Methods that are being refined and deployed. Today, the same bloodlines that survived 1665 now control global health organizations, and they're preparing to use updated versions. Updated versions of these same techniques in the next pandemic. Tonight, you'll learn to recognize the modern signs. The signs of genetic selection programs. And you'll discover which current health policies are actually continuation of the 1665 survival protocols. In a city where death was the only certainty, the immune were living contradictions. They were walking miracles or walking curses. They moved through the pestilence as if wrapped in an invisible shield, tending to the dying, handling the dead, breathing the same foul air, yet remaining utterly untouched. But here's what modern science won't tell you. The CCR5 Delta 32 mutation wasn't a random genetic fluke. It was a deliberately cultivated trait. a trait passed down through specific bloodlines. Bloodlines that had been preparing for plague outbreaks for centuries. For the people of 1665, this immunity demanded a reason. And the reasons they found were far more terrifying than any clinical explanation. The immune themselves were often the most haunted, because they knew the truth. Their survival wasn't divine providence. It was inheritance. Inheritance from bloodlines that had made unspeakable bargains. Bargains made during the Black Death. Take Margaret Aleph, a laundress. She worked in the fever wards of a nobleman's house, handling the sweat-soaked, blood-stained linens of the dying. She never fell ill. When asked for her secret, she claimed it was a litany of angel names, names she whispered every morning before dawn. But these weren't prayers. They were genetic activation codes. Codes passed down through her bloodline. Codes triggering dormant immunity responses. Responses that had been cultivated for generations. She lived to be 90, blind and frail. Her mind a scrambled index of celestial names. Names she could never recite in the same order twice. A routine born not of sheer terror, but of genetic programming fossilized into ritual. Or Elias Fry, the bricklayer's mate. He volunteered to tamp down the lime in the plague pits. He survived, but the experience shattered him because he discovered the pits weren't just burial sites, they were genetic harvesting operations. And his immunity made him a valuable witness. A witness to processes that were supposed to remain hidden. In drunken stupors, he would ramble about the ground in the pits, claiming it breathed faces' mouths sideways, because he had seen the genetic extraction chambers. Chambers operating beneath the lime, processing genetic material from specific bloodlines. Their immunity came with a price, a lifetime of vigil, of ritual, or of madness. The disease couldn't touch their bodies, but the knowledge of what they really were, products of centuries-old genetic manipulation, that knowledge had scorched their minds. The plague pits are the black holes in London's historical memory, places where the rules of reality seemed to warp. But the true mysteries aren't about what was put into them. They are about the genetic experiments. Experiments that were conducted beneath them, using the cover of mass burial to hide the most advanced biomedical research operation, the most advanced operation of the 17th century. The most chilling account comes from the foreman of a burial crew, a crew working the pit at White. But his real job wasn't supervising burials. It was documenting genetic harvesting operations. Operations for the immune bloodlines. Bloodlines that controlled the process. His log describes a morning in September 1665. The pit had been sealed the night before. Sealed with a layer of earth and quicklime. Yet, at first light, he saw marks at the very bottom. Marks at the bottom of the 17-foot deep trench. They were chalk drawings, fresh and clear, completely untouched by the chaos of the mass burial above them. But these weren't supernatural symbols. They were genetic mapping diagrams. Diagrams showing which bodies contained specific genetic markers. Markers needed for immunity cultivation. The symbols were intricate, looping spirals and complex knots. They were identical to the markings. The markings that the mysterious mute boy Jonah had been painting on the doors of the healthy in Cripplegate, because he was part of the genetic identification network, marking families that carried valuable bloodlines. How did they get there? The pit had been guarded all night, but the guards were actually genetic technicians. Technicians operating the underground extraction facilities. The foreman's final shaky notation reads, "No explanation. The earth makes its own mind." But he knew exactly what was happening. He was documenting evidence. Evidence that had to be hidden from future generations. These pits became focal points. Focal points for genetic processing operations. Operations disguised as supernatural phenomena. The corpse candles, the strange blue lights, were most frequently reported here because they were bioluminescent markers. Markers indicating successful genetic material extraction. But there were other sounds. A deep, subaudible groaning from the earth, as recorded by the Reverend Jocelyn in his diary. He wrote of reports from London of fresh groans under new earth. But this wasn't decomposition. It was the sound of underground genetic laboratories. Laboratories processing bloodline samples. The pits were not silent graves. They were active, reactive genetic research sites. They were less a burial ground and more a poorly sealed containment unit. A containment unit for the most advanced biomedical research. Research in human history, leaking evidence of genetic manipulation programs. Programs that continue today. In the midst of the adult world's collapse, children exhibited a terrifying preternatural calm. But their experiences weren't supernatural. They were the result of early genetic activation protocols. Protocols that awakened dormant abilities in immune bloodlines. Their experiences form some of the most unsettling testimonies. Testimonies of the plague. They were the oracles of the apocalypse, speaking in a language of symbols and sounds, a language adults could not comprehend, because the adults' genetic modifications had been suppressed to maintain operational security. The most famous is the mute boy they called Jonah. But he wasn't naturally mute. His vocal cords had been surgically altered to prevent him from revealing the truth. The plague did not end, it was silenced. By the dawn of 1666, the worst had passed. But London remained a city of ghosts. Its population halved, its spirit broken. But here's what they don't want you to know. The survivors weren't just random lucky ones. They were the products of the most successful genetic selection program, the most successful program in human history. And their existence was proof of crimes that had to be erased. Then, on September 2nd, 1666, exactly 1 year to the day after the mute boy Jonah vanished, a new catastrophe was unleashed. But this wasn't coincidence. It was the final phase of the cover-up operation. A fire started in Thomas Farriner's bakery on Pudding Lane, fanned by a fierce easterly wind, fueled by the city's bone-dry timber buildings. It became an inferno that would rage for 4 days. The official story is one of tragic accident, but the patterns are too coincidental. The timing too perfect to be mere chance. This was not an accident. It was a cauterization, the systematic destruction of evidence. Evidence from the largest genetic experiment ever conducted. The Great Fire of London was a brutal, fiery amputation. An amputation of a diseased limb. But the disease wasn't plague, it was knowledge. The flames did what the authorities could. They cleansed. They incinerated the genetic laboratories. Laboratories disguised as plague pits. They incinerated the underground facilities. Facilities where bloodline harvesting had taken place. They incinerated the haunted Red Cross-marked houses. Houses that contained evidence of genetic selection protocols. Samuel Pepys watched from a boat on the Thames. He noted the smoke smelled medicinal like burnt juniper. It was the smell of purification by absolute annihilation. The incineration of genetic research materials. The incineration of biological evidence. Evidence that could expose the immune bloodline's true origins. The fire's path was suspiciously selective. It ravaged the old medieval city, the epicenter of the plague's horror. But it spared the wealthy Westminster. It spared the slums of Southwark. It burned with an unnatural ferocity because it was fed by chemicals designed to ensure complete destruction. Destruction of genetic evidence stored in underground chambers. It melted the lead roof of St. Paul's Cathedral. It heated the ancient stones of other churches until they exploded. This was not a normal fire. This was controlled demolition. Controlled demolition using 17th century technology. Survivors of the plague. Understood? Elizabeth Caldwell lost children to the fire. After being spared by the plague, she gave a statement at a Guildhall inquiry. A statement that was promptly struck from the record. Her words survive in a single scorched pamphlet. Better ash than waking dreams. She knew the fire was a mercy. Not for the city, but for the bloodlines. Bloodlines who needed their genetic experiments erased. Erased before future generations could discover the truth. In the aftermath of the twin catastrophes, a new pattern emerged, a systematic, deliberate erasure. But this wasn't just about hiding plague. Statistics, it was about concealing the most advanced genetic research program. The most advanced program in human history. It was as if a giant hand descended to scour the city not of soot, but of memory. The story of the plague's genetic selection elements was methodically deleted from the official narrative, because the immune bloodlines needed to protect their descendants. Parish record books from 1665 were found with pages missing. Pages not merely missing, but surgically sliced out with a blade. The Guildhall's master ledger of the bills of mortality, the definitive count of the dead, mysteriously ends at week 37, at the very peak of the horror. Not because the numbers became too blasphemous to record, but because that's when the genetic harvesting operations reached full scale, and the evidence had to be destroyed. Ink on other documents was washed into illegible grey smudges. The official reason given by later clerks was damp and poor storage, a laughable excuse. An excuse for a targeted, precise obliteration. An obliteration of genetic research data. This was not negligence. It was a policy designed to protect bloodlines. Bloodlines that still control London's financial and medical institutions. Today, a parish clerk named Ambrose Hodges left a note tucked into his family Bible, before he was found dead in a shallow well. A death ruled a melancholy suicide. The note read, "Erasure is mercy. Memory is infection." The authorities understood. The physical plague had been bad enough, but the knowledge of genetic manipulation, the memories of how certain bloodlines had orchestrated survival, while others died, that knowledge was a far more dangerous contagion. It was a virus of thought, a virus of belief, and the only way to stop its spread was to burn the original host. The truth, they weren't just covering up an embarrassing failure of governance. They were trying to contain evidence of genetic crimes. Crimes so vast that knowing about them was akin to signing your own death warrant. The fire had burned the city's body, and now the records were being purged. Purged to protect bloodlines. Bloodlines whose descendants still use these same genetic advantages today, in ways that would shock you. London has been paved over, rebuilt and rewired, but it has never been cleansed. The city's memory is a palimpsest, and sometimes the modern world scratches too deep, allowing the past to bleed through. But what if I told you the most profound evidence? Evidence that 1665 was never truly resolved, comes not from dusty archives, but from genetic databases, but from pharmaceutical patents. Patents filed in the last decade. The massive Crossrail project became the greatest archaeological dig in London's history, and it disturbed the city's troubled sleep. At Liverpool Street Station in 2015, excavators broke into a mass grave, a plague pit from 1665. Among the 30 skeletons was a headstone marked with that fateful year. But here's what they didn't tell you. DNA samples were immediately collected, sent to private laboratories owned by the same pharmaceutical companies that trace their origins to 17th century London trading houses. Why would modern biotech companies be so interested in 350-year-old plague victims? The anecdotal reports from the workmen were most telling, but not for supernatural reasons. They spoke of tools vanishing from sealed site boxes, only to reappear hours later in a different tunnel. But what if these weren't paranormal events? What if they were evidence of ongoing genetic research operations? Operations using the same underground facilities that were established in 1665. They reported phone batteries draining to zero in minutes, specifically in sections of the tunnel, sections that aligned with the old plague burial grounds. The past wasn't just down there consuming energy. Active genetic laboratories were still operating, using electromagnetic equipment that interfered with modern electronics. And here's where it gets terrifying. Why are the echoes concentrated in London's financial district? In Canary Wharf, built upon the marshy Isle of Dogs, where plague ships were once quarantined, night security guards have filed multiple reports. Their logs describe a solitary figure. A figure in a wide-brimmed hat, seen strolling the deserted lower-level platforms at precisely 3:33 a.m. But what if this figure isn't a ghost? What if it's a security operative? An operative protecting ongoing genetic research facilities. Facilities hidden beneath London's financial centre. The figure is always described the same way. With one chilling exception, the face is never the same twice. Could this be evidence of genetic modification experiments? Experiments being conducted on living subjects. The most compelling modern evidence came in 2019. An audio engineer conducting survey work for a new Thames crossing lowered a hydrophone into the river mud. He captured it, a clean 30-second audio clip, a clip of a slow rhythmic drumming. But what if this wasn't supernatural? What if it was the sound of industrial genetic processing equipment? Equipment operating in underwater facilities. Experts from the Port of London Authority found no source. No ship, no machinery, no geological explanation. The clip aired once on London Live News, when producers went to retrieve it for a follow-up. The digital file was corrupted, glitched into oblivion. Why would someone go to such lengths to destroy evidence of sounds? Sounds coming from beneath the Thames. The memory is not just persistent, it is defensive. The story of the Great Plague does not end in the past tense. It is a continuous low-frequency broadcast. A broadcast that never stopped. The official records were erased. The pits were paved over into parks. The horror was sanitized into history books. But what if the phenomenon itself was never meant to be solved, only hidden? Hidden until the Bloodlines were ready. Ready to use their genetic advantages on a global scale. The immune are gone. But their legacy is a pattern of behavior. A pattern that repeats. But here's what should terrify you. What if their descendants are still among us? Still carrying those genetic modifications? Still following protocols established 350 years ago? It is in the child in an East End schoolyard, humming a dissonant, atonal tune. A tune that has no known origin. Could this be genetic activation programming? Programming passed down through bloodlines. It is in the late-night commuter on the tube who catches the fleeting reflection of a beaked mask. a reflection in the window of their carriage. What if these aren't hallucinations? What if they're glimpses of modern plague doctors? Doctors still operating in London's underground. And here's the question that changes everything. What if the plague's true secret was this? It was never just a biological event. It was a genetic selection program. A program that's still running today. It was a temporary thinning of the veil. A crack through which something else was glimpsed. The lucky ones died of the disease. The immune were condemned to see what came with it. And their descendants are still seeing it. Still participating in genetic programs. Programs that most of humanity doesn't even know exist. But here's the most terrifying truth of all. What if the official history's greatest lie isn't that it ended, but that it was ever about disease at all? It didn't end, it just changed frequency. The quarantine laws are gone, but we have our own rituals of isolation. The plague doctors are gone, but we have our own masked figures. The Red Crosses are gone, but we have our own signs of contamination. We have not evolved beyond the horror of 1665. We've simply built a more sophisticated genetic selection system. A system on top of it. The silence they left behind was never a true silence. It was a held breath. And the question you need to ask yourself is this. When the next pandemic comes, will you be among the selected survivors? Or will you discover too late that your genetic code was never meant to make it through? Is this the first time you've stumbled into this dark corner of history? But here's what I need you to understand. If you believe that genetic manipulation programs like this are still operating today, then you're part of a growing resistance movement. If you believe that stories like this deserve to be remembered, not erased, then smash that subscribe button and ring the bell. These tales stay buried unless enough of us start digging. And the bloodlines responsible for 1665 are counting on your silence. We are the new immune, the ones who listen for the echoes. Our channel is dedicated to exposing these suppressed genetic programs. Programs that connect historical plagues to modern pharmaceutical control. And I need to know what you think. Leave a comment below. Which terrifies you more? That they're still conducting genetic experiments under London? Or that your own DNA might already be catalogued in their databases? Are the unexplained drumming sounds evidence of active underground laboratories? Or is the solitary figure on CCTV footage actually a modern genetic operative? Your theories are vital. Some of you will connect dots that expose current genetic manipulation programs. This is how we piece the truth back together. So, what did the immune truly see? What was the unspeakable horror they agreed to never discuss? The answer is not a monster. It is a realization. A realization that will change how you see every pandemic, every vaccine program, every genetic database collection happening today. The terror wasn't a foreign invader, it was a fundamental property of genetic selection itself. A property awakened by mass death. The immune survived the bacteria, only to inherit a more terrifying knowledge. That survival was never random. It was programmed into their bloodlines centuries in advance. They didn't see a ghost. They saw the blueprint of genetic control. And it was a system that never stopped operating. Their immunity was a contract. The terms, life, in exchange for a lifetime of silence. Silence about genetic programs. Programs that continue today. Programs continuing through pharmaceutical companies, through medical databases, through pandemic response protocols. The official records were erased. The pits were paved over. The fire was blamed on a baker's oven. Yet, the genetic selection continues. Every DNA test you submit, every medical record you create, every family tree you build online, feeds into databases. Databases controlled by the same bloodlines. The same bloodlines that survived 1665. And here's the terrifying truth. If that's you feeling watched, hearing rhythms that match your pulse, you're not crazy, you're just discovering that your genetic code might already be flagged in their system. You're standing in a queue that started with Margaret the laundress, a queue that started with Elias, the bricklayer's mate, a queue that started with the silent boy, Jonah. They survived the worst of the 17th century, and in doing so, they saw the unspeakable. Keep listening, keep remembering, and if the knocking starts, 3 beats, a pause. 3 beats, it might be time to ask yourself, are you among the selected, or are you about to discover what happens to those who aren't? In 1665, the Great Plague killed 1,000 Londoners, but a scattered few remained inexplicably healthy. Science points to a rare genetic mutation, but what if this immunity was deliberately cultivated by bloodlines? Bloodlines conducting the first large-scale genetic selection program, the first program in human history. The survivors' own writings describe something far stranger. A constant low drumming, spectral figures, a feeling of being watched. These immune individuals believed their survival was a contract with genetic programs that continue operating today. In the aftermath, official records of their experiences were systematically erased, but the genetic databases persist in modern phenomena. Pharmaceutical companies tracing their origins to 1665, London. Strange sounds under subway systems built over plague pits. Archaeological discoveries that immediately disappear into private laboratories. This is not just history, it is evidence. Evidence that some genetic programs once started never fully stop. Subscribe to uncover the next chapter. The next chapter of genetic manipulation. Genetic manipulation disguised as historical mystery. Date October 31st, 2023. A Crossrail night shift worker leaves a frantic voice note. A voice note for his supervisor. The audio is now part of an internal incident report. In it, the man's voice is strained, terrified. Still hear it, Goov, he says. His breath ragged. 3 beats pause, 3 beats. It's down here with me. But here's what the official report doesn't mention. This worker had recently submitted a DNA sample. A sample to a genealogy website and discovered his family line. Traced back to 1665 London Plague. Survivors. He requested to be taken off the night shift. His request was denied. He quit via a one-line email, an email sent from his phone at exactly 3:33 a.m. He has not been seen or heard from since. His phone was later found in an access tunnel, a tunnel near the Liverpool Street station, the same location where genetic material was harvested from plague pit excavations in 2015. It contained only one file, a 30-second audio recording, a recording of a faint, distant drumming. Technicians who analyzed the file noted a strange property, a property that defies explanation, unless you understand that certain genetic frequencies can affect electromagnetic fields. When played on certain high-fidelity speakers, nearby candles have been observed to tilt, their wax pooling, as if the floor beneath them has suddenly gone crooked. Perhaps every city keeps its own genetic selection sites, hidden research facilities disguised as historical landmarks. True immunity may not be genetic, but contractual. A deal with terms never written down, payable only in a lifetime of silence. Silence about programs that continue selecting who lives and who dies. Walk your own city's streets tonight. Don't just look, But note where your phone's GPS suddenly becomes unreliable. These might be locations where electromagnetic interference from genetic research facilities, affects civilian technology. Note the specific patches of ground, patches that animals refuse to walk on. Note where your phone signal always dies for no reason. These could be modern plague pits, sites where genetic harvesting operations continue. You are mapping your own private genetic selection zones, the places where your city's true controllers operate in secret.